March 9, 1945, Tokyo. The sirens start at 10:08 p.m. Not the sharp wail of panic, the low, grinding drone that means they're already here, above the clouds, invisible, untouchable. 334 aircraft, flying in formation so tight it looks like a single shadow sliding across the moon. On the ground, 1 million people are running. They don't know where the bombs will fall. They don't know if the shelters will hold. They only know one thing: the sound. That deep, rhythmic hum that seems to come from everywhere and nowhere. The sound of engines built to fly higher than any fighter can chase them. The sound the Japanese have learned to call by a different name. There was no warning left to give. Akuma no Hikoki, the devil's plane. What happens when terror has wings? This is not a story about a plane. It's a story about the moment warfare stopped being something you could see coming, about the psychological breaking point of an entire nation, not through invasion, not through blockade, but through a machine that redefined what it meant to be defenseless. The B-29 Superfortress didn't just drop bombs. It dropped the illusion of safety. It flew so high that anti-aircraft guns couldn't reach it, so far that no one believed America could even get there. And when it arrived in waves, hundreds at a time, turning night into day, cities into ash. By the summer of 1945, Japanese civilians had stopped looking up. There was no point. You couldn't see them. You couldn't stop them. You could only wait. Some didn't even bother running anymore. This is the story of how one aircraft became a myth, how engineering became fear, and how a bomber earned a name that still echoes in the darkest corners of military history. You're about to see why Japan called it the devil's plane, and why they were right. In 1944, the United States had a problem that couldn't be solved with courage or numbers. Japan was losing the war, but it was losing slowly. The Imperial Navy had been shattered at Midway. Island after island had fallen. But the Japanese mainland remained untouched, protected by 2,000 miles of open ocean and the simple fact that no American bomber could fly far enough to reach it and return. The B-17 Flying Fortress, the workhorse of the European campaign, had proven nearly indestructible over Germany. We covered how it earned that reputation in our episode on The B-17 Wasn't Built to Survive. So why couldn't the Germans kill it? But range was its weakness. Even from captured Pacific Islands, it couldn't reach Tokyo. And without the ability to strike the heart of Japan's war production, the island-hopping campaign would grind on for years. The Pentagon knew the math. Every month the war continued meant tens of thousands more Allied casualties. Japan's leadership had made it clear. They would fight to the last civilian. Invasion was inevitable, and it would be apocalyptic. So in 1943, Boeing was handed an impossible assignment: build a bomber that could carry 5 tons of explosives, fly 3,500 miles without refueling, operate at altitudes above 30,000 feet, and do it all while keeping the crew alive in sub-zero, unpressurized hell. If Boeing failed, the invasion would come instead. They called it the B-29 Superfortress. If that turning point matters, mark it, and we'll keep going. It was the most expensive weapons project of the war, more expensive even than the Manhattan Project. It had 4 massive Wright R-3350 engines, each producing 2,200 horsepower. A pressurized cabin so crews could breathe and function at altitudes where the air was too thin for Japanese fighters to follow. A remote-controlled gun system that could track targets with terrifying precision. And a range that made the impossible suddenly inevitable. By late 1944, the first B-29s were arriving in the Mariana Islands, Saipan, Tinian, Guam. Bases carved out of jungle and coral, close enough to Japan that the Superfortress could finally reach what no other bomber could. But the Japanese didn't know that yet. They had seen reconnaissance photos. They knew something was coming, but they had no idea what it could do. Their intelligence estimated the B-29 could maybe reach the southern coast of Japan, perhaps Kyushu, if the Americans were willing to risk it. They were wrong. On November 24, 1944, 111 B-29s lifted off from Saipan. Destination: Tokyo. It was the first American raid on the Japanese capital since the Doolittle raid in 1942, a symbolic strike launched from aircraft carriers that couldn't be repeated. This time, it wasn't symbolic. This time, they were coming back. The first raids were high-altitude precision strikes, daylight missions. The B-29s would climb to 30,000 feet, higher than Mount Everest Base Camp, and release their payloads on aircraft factories, steel plants, fuel depots. The Japanese scrambled everything they had. Mitsubishi A6M-0s, the fighters that had dominated the Pacific in 1942, clawed their way upward. At 20,000 feet, the pilots were gasping through oxygen masks. At 25,000 feet, their engines were choking on thin air. At 30,000 feet, they stalled out, wings shuddering, unable to climb any higher. The B-29s flew in formation above them, untouched. Anti-aircraft batteries opened fire. Shells burst at 20,000 feet, 25,000 feet. But the Superfortress was beyond their ceiling. The guns that had torn apart B-17s over Germany were useless here. For the first time in the war, Japan faced an enemy they could not reach. And warfare changed with it. But the early raids weren't devastating. High-altitude bombing was precise in theory, but at 6 miles up, with jet stream winds that could hit 200 miles per hour, even the Norden bomb site struggled. Bombs scattered. Factories were damaged but not destroyed. The American command was frustrated. They needed a new strategy. Enter Major General Curtis LeMay. LeMay was brought in to command the 21st Bomber Command in January 1945. He looked at the data and made a decision that would change everything. Stop trying to hit specific factories, start burning entire cities. The logic was cold and clear. Japanese war production wasn't centralized in massive industrial complexes like in Germany. It was distributed, small workshops, home factories, entire neighborhoods dedicated to building aircraft parts, assembling munitions. You couldn't precision bomb a city where every block was part of the war machine, but you could burn it. March 9, 1945. Operation Meeting House. LeMay made 3 changes that would turn the B-29 from a precision weapon into an apocalypse machine. First, strip out the guns. Except for the tail turret, every defensive weapon came off. The weight savings meant more bombs. Second, fly at night, fly low. Come in at 5,000 to 7,000 feet, below the jet stream, where accuracy was brutal and immediate. Third, load incendiaries. Not high explosives, M69 napalm cluster bombs, designed specifically to set wooden Japanese cities ablaze. Even some American crews knew this was something different. At 10:08 p.m., the first Pathfinder B-29s arrived over Tokyo. They dropped their payloads in an X pattern across the Shitamachi district, the dense, working-class heart of the city. The fires marked the target zone. Then the main force arrived, wave after wave. 334 aircraft, each one carrying 7 tons of incendiaries. The bombs tumbled through the night sky and burst open mid-air, scattering napalm-filled tubes across rooftops, streets, alleys. The fires started small, dozens of them, then hundreds, then they merged. What happened next wasn't just a firestorm, it was a phenomenon that defied human experience. The fires grew so hot they created their own weather. Superheated air rose in a column, sucking in oxygen from every direction. Winds reached 100 miles per hour, feeding the flames, spreading them faster than anyone could run. The temperature at ground level hit 1800 degrees Fahrenheit, hot enough to melt glass, to boil rivers, to ignite human bodies before the flames even touched them. People ran toward the Sumida River, thinking water would save them. The river boiled. Air raid shelters became ovens. Families suffocated together in the dark as oxygen was sucked out by the firestorm above. The crews could smell the city burning even through their oxygen masks. The updrafts from the fires were so violent they threw aircraft hundreds of feet into the air.
Pilots fought their controls just to stay level. One bombardier radioed back, "It's like flying over a volcano."
The raid lasted 3 hours. When the sun rose on March 10th, 16 square miles of Tokyo had ceased to exist. Over 100,000 people were dead, more than would die in the atomic bombing of Hiroshima 5 months later. 1 million were homeless. And then, everything changed. The Japanese government had no protocol for this. Civil defense officials had drilled citizens on how to fight fires, bucket brigades, neighborhood fire teams, sand and water. It was all useless. You couldn't fight a firestorm. You could only die in it or run fast enough to escape it. In the weeks that followed, the B-29s came back. Not to Tokyo alone. Nagoya, Osaka, Kobe, Yokohama. Every major city. Sometimes multiple cities in the same night. By April, Japan wasn't a battlefield anymore. It was a series of fires. The civilian population stopped going to work. Factories fell silent, not because they were bombed, but because workers refused to leave their shelters. Parents sent their children into the countryside, hoping they'd be safer. They usually weren't. The B-29s hit smaller cities too. The Japanese military tried everything. They developed new tactics, kamikaze fighters that would ram the B-29s in midair, suicide missions, desperate last-ditch attempts to bring down even one bomber. Occasionally, it worked. A B-29 would go down in flames, taking 11 men with it. But for every one lost, 30 more came the next night. Japanese propaganda tried to rally morale. Radio broadcasts called the B-29 crews barbarians, demons, cowards who attack women and children. They weren't wrong about the targets, but the messaging didn't matter. Fear doesn't care about propaganda. On the ground, the name had already taken hold. Akuma no Hikoki, the Devil's Plane. Not because of what it destroyed, because of what it represented. Total helplessness. An enemy that could strike anywhere, anytime, and could not be stopped. By June 1945, Japan's urban infrastructure was gone. 66 cities had been hit. Over 40% of the built-up area in Japan's major population centers had burned. Over 300,000 civilians were dead, millions displaced. The Imperial Japanese Navy, once the third largest in the world, had been reduced to scattered remnants hiding in harbors. The army was dug in, preparing for the invasion they knew was coming, but their supply lines were shattered, their factories silent, their oil reserves nearly empty. And still, the B-29s came. What the Japanese leadership finally understood, too late, was that the B-29 wasn't just a tactical weapon. It was a strategic checkmate. They had built their entire defensive doctrine around the idea that Japan was an island fortress, that the ocean was a moat, that even if the Allies could land troops, the cost would be so catastrophic that America would negotiate a conditional surrender. The B-29 made all of that irrelevant. It didn't need to invade. It could simply erase Japan from the sky. And the worst part, the part that broke the will of even the hardliners, was that it was only getting started. But the story of the B-29 wasn't finished yet. By August 1945, Japan had lost the war in every measurable way, but refused to surrender. The Supreme Council for the direction of the war was deadlocked. The military leadership still believed they could inflict enough casualties during an Allied invasion to force a negotiated peace. They pointed to Iwo Jima, where 7,000 Americans died, taking an island 8 square miles in size. They pointed to Okinawa, where 12,000 Americans fell in 3 months of fighting. An invasion of the Japanese mainland, they argued, would cost the Allies 1 million casualties, maybe more. Surely, at some point, America would accept terms. But they had miscalculated catastrophically. The B-29 had already done what an invasion was supposed to do. It had destroyed Japan's ability to wage war. Industrial production had collapsed. The transportation network was in ruins. Food distribution had broken down to the point that famine was a real possibility by winter. More critically, it had shattered civilian morale. In a nation where the government had spent years conditioning its people to fight to the death for the emperor, the B-29 had done something no amount of propaganda could reverse. It had made survival feel impossible. The strategic shift was profound. Traditional warfare required you to defeat an enemy's military to win. The B-29 campaigns proved you could bypass the military entirely and attack the will to fight itself. Not through conquest, through relentless, inescapable destruction from above. American planners saw the results and drew a grim conclusion. The invasion might not even be necessary. If the blockade held and the firebombing continued, Japan would collapse from within by the end of 1945. But there was a darker option now on the table. The Manhattan Project, the other secret weapons program that had cost billions, had successfully tested a new type of bomb in the New Mexico desert on July 16th.
A single device with the explosive power of 20,000 tons of TNT. And the only aircraft in the American arsenal capable of carrying it was the B-29. In late July, a modified Superfortress named Enola Gay arrived on Tinian Island. Its bomb bay had been reconfigured. Its crew had trained for months on a mission they didn't fully understand. On August 6, 1945, it took off at 2:45 a.m. Destination: Hiroshima. What happened at 8:15 a.m. that morning is well known. What's less understood is why the B-29 was chosen for the mission in the first place. It wasn't just about range or payload capacity. It was about psychological impact. The Japanese people had spent a year learning to fear the silhouette of the B-29, the sound of its engines, the inevitability of its arrival. When the atomic bomb fell, it fell from the belly of the Devil's Plane, the machine that had already become synonymous with unstoppable destruction. 3 days later, another B-29, Boxcar, dropped a second atomic bomb on Nagasaki. On August 15th, Emperor Hirohito addressed the Japanese people by radio for the first time in history. His voice was thin, formal, using classical language most couldn't fully understand. But the message was clear: Japan would surrender. He cited a new and most cruel bomb as part of the reason. But he also spoke of the broader devastation: the cities lost, the suffering of the people, the impossibility of continuing the fight. The B-29 had broken Japan before the atomic bombs ever fell. The atomic bombs simply made the breaking irreversible. If preserving how these wars were actually fought matters to you, this channel exists for that reason. When the war ended, the meaning of the B-29 became impossible to ignore. In Europe, the Allied strategic bombing campaign had required years and tens of thousands of sorties to achieve what the B-29 accomplished in Japan in less than 9 months. The difference wasn't just the aircraft, it was the totality of the strategy. The legacy of the Superfortress reshaped military doctrine for generations. It proved that air superiority alone could decide wars. It validated the concept of long-range strategic bombing as a decisive weapon. And it set the template for every heavy bomber that followed, from the B-52 Stratofortress to the B-2 Spirit. But it also left a darker inheritance. The B-29 campaigns blurred the line between military and civilian targets in ways that are still debated today. The firebombing of Tokyo killed more people in a single night than most battles in human history. The atomic bombings ended the war, but at a cost that haunts the world's conscience. In Japan, The memory of the B-29 didn't fade. Survivors called it Akuma no Hikoki until the day they died. Not out of bitterness, but because no other name captured the totality of what it represented. A machine that couldn't be stopped, a threat that couldn't be escaped, a shadow that fell from the sky and changed everything. And this is where the story finally makes sense. If someone in your family lived through the war, on any side, share where they were or what they carried with them afterward. Here's what most people miss about the B-29. It wasn't the bombs that made it the devil's plane. It was the schedule. The Japanese had faced overwhelming force before. They'd fought the Chinese for years. They'd seen the industrial might of the Soviet Union at Khalkhin Gol. They knew what superior numbers looked like. But the B-29 was different. Every other weapon in warfare could be countered. Tanks could be ambushed. Ships could be torpedoed. Fighters could be shot down. Even the unstoppable B-17s over Europe, they bled. The Luftwaffe made them pay for every mission. Crews knew they might not come home. The B-29 operated in a realm beyond reach. Japanese radar would pick them up. Air raid sirens would wail. Fighters would scramble. Guns would fire. And none of it mattered. The B-29s would arrive on schedule, drop their payloads with mechanical precision, and disappear back into the sky. Night after night, city after city. What broke Japan wasn't the destruction, it was the realization that there was no move left to make. No tactical brilliance that could save them. No amount of courage or sacrifice that could change the outcome. The chessboard had been cleared, and only one piece remained in play. The Emperor's surrender speech didn't just cite the atomic bomb. He used a phrase that's often mistranslated. The war situation has developed not necessarily to Japan's advantage. It was the greatest understatement in history. But buried in that formal, detached language was an admission that Japan's leadership had spent the entire war refusing to make. They had been outmatched not by soldiers, but by engineering, by logistics, by a nation that could build 3,000 B-29s while simultaneously fighting a two-front war across two oceans. The devil's plane wasn't a devil because it was evil. It was a devil because it was inevitable. The last B-29 combat mission flew on August 14, 1945. Hours before the surrender was announced, over 300 Superfortresses launched one final raid. They hit targets near Tokyo, fuel depots, arsenals, anything left that could prolong the fight. Some crews didn't know the war was about to end. Others did, and flew anyway. When they returned to base, the runways were lined with crews celebrating. Flares lit up the night sky. Men who had flown mission after mission into hell were crying, laughing, collapsing with relief. The devil's plane had done its job. In the decades that followed, the B-29 faded from the public memory, overshadowed by the atomic bombs it carried, by the jet age it helped usher in, by the Cold War bombers that replaced it. Museums preserved a few. The rest were scrapped, melted down, turned into cars and refrigerators for the post-war boom. But in Japan, the memory remained. Survivors of the firebombings, the Hibakusha of Tokyo, Osaka, Nagoya, carried the scars for life. They told their children about the night the sky turned red, about the sound of engines that meant there was nowhere left to run. They never stopped calling it by its name, Akuma no Hikoki, the devil's plane. Not because of what it destroyed, but because it proved that in modern war, distance is no defense, altitude is no sanctuary, and hope can be incinerated in a single night. But the B-29 wasn't the only weapon Japan had no answer for. And deep in the New Mexico desert, another kind of fire was being born, one that would make even the devil's plane look merciful. And that is a story of its own.